All right, thank you so much. So without further ado, may I please request the first informative speaker to take the floor.
Can everyone hear me clearly?
Yep.
All right, let me set up my timer and I shall start in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We don't think states should be using taxpayer money that has been hard earned and very limited on a risky investment such as startups. We think that they need to spend more wisely. Throughout the course of this debate, we're going to prove to you a few key things. Number one, why startups are likely to fail. Number two, why SMEs offer better value. And number three, why even if startups succeed, we think that SMEs are better. Let's understand first why startups are likely to fail. Likely to fail for a few key reasons. Number one, often they lack the kind of brand value required to attract both customers and investors, which means that people are often very wary of trying their product. Number two, we think that lots of them just don't have the kind of market research or market experience required to know whether or not their product actually has market value. So in comparison, SME has already been selling its product. It knows that there's a demand out there. Number three, we think that they often have new entrepreneurs who are great technological minds often and who know how to make a great device, but do not have the knowledge or the expertise required to know the market and to know whether or not their product actually solves a market demand. Fourthly, we think that they're often not resilient to, for example, market shocks, so for example, things like Corona, often because of things like the fact they don't have a built-in consumer base, a set organizational structure, and most importantly, they cannot survive on government money alone. They need other investors as well. Wherein there is an negative economic shock, other investors, because of the fact that this is a risky investment, will immediately take out their money because they no longer think that this is worthwhile in the kind of circumstance that the economic circumstance that they're in, which makes success even less likely. Having said that, let's also understand that government funds are limited, and ultimately these startups are a gamble. So we think, for example, the fact that Zuckerberg and all these other handful of stories have come about have meant that there's been a lot of glorification of lots of these startups. Shows like Silicon Valley, etc., have meant that lots of startups have come up to the point at which there's market saturation in what they're doing. Often, lots of them are doing the very same thing. And for example, things like technology, things like AI, which means that lots of them are going to be competing for the same investors, the same market. This makes them even more likely to fail. Having said that, then, why are SMEs a safer bet? We think SMEs are a safer bet for a few key reasons. Number one, we think that they often have an established market value in that they've been selling a product for a while and they know that it sells. Number two, we often think that they have things like savings established. So, for example, they're able to withstand market shocks much better. Number three, they often have more reliable investors who've been investing in them for long periods of time, often have a degree of loyalty. And the fact that they're lower risk and they actually have something that's been selling for a while means that in times of economic crises, these investors are less likely to jump ship. Number three, we think supply chains are important because lots of these supply chains are very complicated. There are lots of places where you could get parts for your product from, and you don't know the best deal. The fact that these SMEs have been around a while means that they have a very good relationship with the networks of supply chains. They've often been through the trial and error of, for example, engaging with bad parts of the supply chain, which means that they often have much better, much higher quality parts, much cheaper parts, and can produce much better. Fourthly, we think they often have an experience of working in this line, which means that they're better able to organizationally structure themselves, better able to discipline their workforce, those sorts of things. Number three, they have an established consumer base through things like brand development, through the fact that they're already selling to a market where they perhaps might have a degree of loyalty. Fourthly, we think that they benefit from economies of scale, in that they've already done the basic structure of the organization, in that they've done a basic amount of R&D, they've built their offices, they've invested a sunk cost, which means that that sort of stuff is already out of the way, and you're already certain that there is a product to be sold, which means that they're safer and more likely to expand this product and expand their market in, for example, employing more people, in, for example, selling to newer markets, making more products, perhaps adding a variation of their product and generally speaking, expanding and increasing their competition. This makes them good competitors for big business because now you have a product that is certainly going out into the market, and increasingly so when we give them more money that they can use to subsidize their costs, become more competitive, improve their quality, sell and access new markets. This is particularly important because understand that this makes them a safer investment where you have more, for example, product choice and better competition for big businesses. But I'll get to that in a bit. Let's assume that lots of these small companies work and they have something to sell. We think that there are problems with that. Number one, acquisitions. The fact that there's some inherent risk always associated with startups, even the good ones, means that lots of their owners are afraid of losing their investment. This is important because in the kinds of lifestyles that they've been raised, we're making, for example, quick money is very important in, for example, where they're told to quickly make something, sell it off, and live the billionaire lifestyle. We think in that sort of market, they're likely to sell off whatever they have as soon as they've established a base to a bigger company. This is important because it reduces competition and takes them off the market. This sort of risk anxiety doesn't exist to the same degree with SMEs, where they're more likely to experience a stable income and expect a stable income in the future. Number two, we think that they're better competitors to these big markets because of this, because they're less likely to be removed from the market by an acquisition, because of the fact that they can, for example, they might have a product, they might have developed a product that's very good. They might be able to appreciate the extra liquidity that they get from governments to, for example, advance things like branding, improve, for example, improve their savings, absorb shocks, market shocks much better, those sorts of things, expand to new markets, etc. etc. This is particularly important because they're better competitors to bigger companies because they're more established, they have better brand names, and they can use this money to sell at a better, lower price. This can push big businesses to lower their prices because of the competition. And even if they can't compete with them nationally, we think at the very least they can compete with them regionally. So, for example, a Lahore-specific service or a Karachi-specific service, perhaps competing with big business. It's also important to note that if these startups were super great, we think that private investors are already likely to invest in them. So if there's a very low risk sort of investment that is already likely to work, we think that angel investors are likely to invest in them anyways. I think that SMEs need this investment often because attracting newer investors is often hard because there's often, for example, very little profit margin to be had. So big, sexy angel investors are unlikely to come to them. Let's establish then what kind of benefits are accrued in the comparative there then in case both work. We think that there are two important things. Number one, we think that SMEs, because of the kind of scale that they're likely to operate at, are often more local. So they have no big ambitions to go international. We think that lots of these startups often start off with big ambitions. They want to work internationally, which means that they're often likely to pursue, for example, acquisitions and investors from international markets like Facebook, like Twitter, etc. This is particularly important because their technology and the benefits that are required by them can be taken and used to grow corporations abroad. This means that this is a bad investment for a government because the effects are no longer localized. Secondly, we think that startups are often located within urban centers, often because that's where business incubators are had. That's where often, for example, your lots of university incubators are had. Your technological incubators like Silicon Valley are largely there, which means that their benefits are likely to be more localized to these sorts of places. They're likely developed by locals from there. SMEs, on the other hand, are geographically diverse. They're likely to be developed in geographically diverse areas like rural towns, etc. So they're more likely to be concentrated benefits to those sorts of underdeveloped areas that the state has an incentive and a duty to establish. For all those reasons, we urge you to vote Gov.
All right, I'll acknowledge the first affirmative speaker. May I please request the first negative speaker to take the floor? Thank you.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, you're audible. Yep.
Just give me a second. All right, I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The first affirmative speaker hitches their entire case on risk. I'm going to tell you what risk looks like. Risk is throwing money at tried and tested standards and metrics of capitalism in an era when artificial intelligence is likely to render most workers as unviable and redundant. Risk is throwing areas and money at industries that are very resistant to change in an era when multinational corporations are actively acquiring the mechanisms of new technology to screw over your small, you know what I mean, enterprises. That is what is risk. That's what opposition aims to prevent in this debate. Here are two things that opposition supports. First, that we think that SMEs, as a result of prioritizing stability, oftentimes are going to be unable to adapt to incoming technological shifts that are going to render them invalid and vulnerable in the future either ways, which then will prove that there is no a priori good in prioritizing SMEs. Secondly, I think this is also a debate about breaking monopolies and where we have the best stake possible in acquiring new technologies before multinational corporations or adverse possessors or adverse individuals with differing types of interests are able to acquire them and entrench themselves further in particular markets. Now, let me be very clear on what exactly it is I defend, because I think the first affirmative speaker is the most uncharitable speaker I have witnessed in this tournament. The first thing that they try first to defend is apparently our burden is to defend failing startups. Like, guys, if that's the debate, you also have to defend failing SMEs, right? Surely this debate exists in a reasonable middle ground where both of us can assume some level of success within both industries, because I'm sure the edge score didn't intend for this to be a lopsided comparative the way the first affirmative is trying to posit it. With that in mind, how exactly does our selections process work? First, in order to give funding towards an SME, we would have a rigorous selection process that would fend and prioritize the following things. We would have viability, we would check market trends, we would check their financial abilities, we would check the projections of where this company is likely to end up. Essentially, the same way Singapore actively funded Grab and checked that they were viable to be likely in the future, is the same way we will check our startups as well. So what does this do to a lot of the affirmative case first? A lot of their harms about why startups are failing, like, yes, that's true, but they don't apply anymore in this particular debate because we are literally going to be averse towards the startups failing to begin with. This is literally in line with the incentive of every national investment fund to begin with. Number two, how much would we allocate towards these companies? Because I think there is an odd assumption in the world of government that SMEs are apparently just going to collapse and disappear in our world. I don't think that's true for the reasons that, like the first affirmative themselves provide, the fact that they've been around for a very long time, the fact that they've been entrenched quite strongly within the market, the fact that they've already been well funded by governments to begin with. Just because we remove funding from them, that doesn't mean they're going to become redundant. I think it's the converse. I think they are actively being able to survive, and they actually don't quite need the money from governments to begin with. That's why when you move these revenue streams towards startups, you are not choosing one over the other. You are rather leaving one that is already capable of processing and handling itself within an economy. We are rather just prioritizing a party that could fail, and we are just preventing that failure to begin with. Now, that is it for the setup of this debate. This is the more reasonable middle ground that I think the debate must exist in. This is the context that government must engage in. I have two areas of response to the speaker before me first. Now, the first major benefit, and this is where they were being reasonable with it, which is to suggest that there is a lot of harms in startups, that they start up and then they sell off to companies, larger companies, to get billions. Let's question why they do that to begin with. The reason why is because they are not viable to begin with, because there's no assured level of funding for these companies to begin with. You think people from Malaysia actually want to sell out to America? No, they don't. But the reality is they cannot survive because there's no active injection of stability and funding for these companies to begin with. In a world where governments are actively investing or actively a part of these companies to begin with, the incentive structure to sell off your SME or to sell off your startup doesn't quite exist because you don't need to acquire that money to begin with. Second is with regards to the profit incentive area. I think this is precisely the problem. The reason as to why, like, people are settling in the world of affirmative is literally because that they cannot go further with the type of risks that they should be able to take on. In a world where there is an active government injection of funds, they are able to predictably and stably enter markets and able to take on risks to an extent that it doesn't hurt them as much when they fail, because governments are able to back them up. We can minimize the harms of their risk. What this proves is that at best, the case of the affirmative is neutral. At worst, they actively diminish achievement, they actively diminish innovation. Now, let me start with my argumentation. Let me ask a very fair question. What's the reality of the current business world? I've already suggested that SMEs are very well funded. They really don't need this money. But what's the next thing? As a result of SMEs prioritizing stability, there are 4 structural reasons as to why they are oftentimes very resistant to very necessary types of changes. The first is that because they're oftentimes run by families, they're very traditionalist in the way that they try to use their businesses. Second is because they're highly resistant to structural changes, because it would mean completely overhauling their systems that cost a lot of money, or potentially even laying off staff that were with them for a very long time because they could potentially become redundant. What I've proven here is that SMEs are not going to change, and they are highly resistant to change. Now, what's the problem with this, and why is this a very important context for you to consider? The world is changing. MNCs and private companies are actively expanding their base and technology every single day. But the ways in which they innovate themselves is to actively wreck SMEs, to make their business methods outdated. The reason for this is because oftentimes SMEs are literally the only competition, or the largest competition rather, towards these MNCs to begin with. Now, what does this result in? As a result of being very unwilling to adapt to change, many of these SMEs are quite likely to fail somewhere in the future, because private corporations and MNCs adopt much better versions, or much clearer and faster and more efficient systems that SMEs don't adapt. So what does that mean for the comparative of the debate? The debate is not let's fund SMEs over startups. The debate is you fund a group of companies or a type of corporation that is literally in the future on the risk of becoming redundant. And they're not only becoming redundant, they are adverse and resistant to changing their business structures for the structural reasons that I told you earlier. Given that, how does our side comparatively weigh out on this? First, when you actively fund the startups as a state, there's a couple of things that you do. You acquire disruptive forms of technology. Now, why is this very important? Because I think the affirmative assumes that these startups are just going to be like, yeah, okay, you didn't fund this, I guess it's time to kumbaya, go home. That's not the reality. They are going to look for funding in some worlds. But the reality is, it is in the world of affirmative that they have to sell off this technology to huge, large billion-dollar companies. Now, why is this particularly harmful? The ways in which these companies actively use this tech is to entrench themselves and monopolize local markets so that all other types of competition cannot acquire or have a stake within the market. Why is this particularly harmful? First, you have an entrenchment of monopolies that you can't break up. Second, in our world, this is comparatively better because we as a government acquire these new disruptive forms of technology. What does this mean? We can democratize them across SMEs within our country, or GLCs to begin with. So SMEs that previously were on the verge or the trajectory of failure no longer have to do so, because we can give them and introduce these new forms of tech into their industries. The world is changing. SMEs are dying. We have to take a risky move, because the alternative is sure failure. Thank you.
All right, I'll acknowledge the first negative speaker. May I please request the second affirmative speaker to take the floor, Jader?
Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, starting in a few. I want to start off with an observation, which is, of course, the CA team wanted us to debate a motion in which everybody had the same levels of like risk, and everybody was this, like likelihood of success was the same on each side. I'm just not sure this is true. I'm quite frankly sure that this is fucking bullshit, because obviously this debate happens on the ground where there's a likelihood of success that we need to measure. Insofar as we prove that the likelihood of success of SMEs is much better than the likelihood of success of these guys, we take this debate. Insofar as we prove that the vast majority of SMEs are going to do much better than the vast majority of startups, that is a huge harm that governments, of course, need to consider. They can't just run away with this assertion that this is not the debate. Now let's move on to what their mechanism is. And I over here want to talk about costs, right? Because let's look at what their mechanism is. We are going to judge all of these sorts of organizations based on specific kinds of metrics, and then we're going to give them money. I would posit there are a couple of problems with this. One, insofar as you want to check every single startup that comes up and give them this sort of money, that increases costs. At the point at which you have to actually investigate the likelihood of every single thing or every single sort of product increasing, there are costs. And I would posit that these are major costs. You can't ignore them in this debate. Market research amounts to fucking millions of dollars across the world, or billions across the world. That is what states need to invest in, just to know, by the way, whether they should invest in this sort of organization or not? That's the first thing. I think the second thing is with regards to cost, we get much more marginal benefits than these guys do. Notice on our side, we have variable costs like, do you want to hire another worker? Do you want to run an ad in a local newspaper? The marginal costs are not that big. What are the costs in their world? One, you need IT professionals to begin working on the startup to begin with. So I think upfront that cost exists. You need more software. You need more factories to build all of this sort of technology. Insofar as that is true, per dollar, we get much more change than these guys do, especially given the fact that these guys are gambling. Now, insofar as this framing is done, I'm going to talk about 2 or 3 things in this debate. One, I'm going to talk about risk and why that matters. 2, I'm going to talk about economic effects and generally competition. Now, insofar as risk is talked about, I want you to note one thing. They have given you no structural analysis for why these sorts of organizations are not risky. I want you to note that PM gave you 5 specific reasons for why these are likely to fail. There is a reason why 70% of startups in Silicon Valley fail right now. One, you don't have knowledge. Oftentimes these people are college graduates or not even college graduates who don't understand how business operations are work, don't understand what market needs are, oftentimes just have an idea of what technology they want to run. 2, they don't have relationships in the market. That is to say that they don't have relationships with suppliers, distributors, and generally, and then the third thing, which is brand presence also doesn't exist. So you don't have relationships with consumers to begin with. At the point at which states are investing, by the way, this is just an idea. The product probably isn't even fucking there at this point. So I want to point out that this is a huge issue for these organizations. And the last thing that Vani pointed out crucially was market shocks. Because you don't have these sorts of relationships and the risk is immense, at the point at which markets go into recession, or at the point at which you have something like COVID-19, these sorts of organizations are the first ones that go to shit because investors leave them, private investors leave, and lots of these people don't find work. This is crucially something that is beneficial on our side of the house and also important to notice because this debate is happening throughout the world. That is, developing countries oftentimes have recessions. They oftentimes don't have economies that do so well. So risk is paramount in their world. Then what do they do to tell you like we outweigh risk? They say, we have multinational corporations funding AI research and these sorts of organizations are going to be redundant. So let's look at the redundancy comparison because again, I think Vani pre-butted this, but they have given you no response. Insofar as there is market saturation, actually startups are also likely to be much more redundant internationally. Why? Because I'm finding a new app in Pakistan. There are apps that are being made across the world similar to what I'm making because presumably everybody can have like similar ideas, but also ideas of how to solve market needs. Now, insofar as that is true, even if say, given that this is a long-term project, right, you need to invest, you need to do lots of stuff to get a product finally into the market. Let's assume that there is a startup outside my country or even within my country, given the startup glorification that we've done, which does the same thing, only might even do it better. I think redundancy then is much worse on their side, specifically given the kinds of government resources that you have spent in trying to prop this sort of industry and organization up. So I'm not sure why we lose that on redundancy. But 2, I think this sort of redundancy narrative only applies in the very long run, but also only applies in urban centers, something that Vani again told you. That is to say that oftentimes SMEs don't operate in say Chicago or like whatever like hub you have, right? Oftentimes they also operate in regional areas like towns, etc., which don't have MNC presence. Why don't they have MNC presence? Because consumers over there oftentimes don't have the purchasing power to purchase products that MNCs produce, which is why oftentimes these sorts of organizations have a presence in these sorts of areas. And also because there are infrastructural issues and other issues that MNCs don't get to access these areas. Insofar as this is true, this also means that you are much more likely then on their side of the house to get money to organizations that 1, don't give you anything in the short run, 2, require lots of money, 3, might fail in the long run, and 4thly, even if they succeed, they don't get their benefits to regional organizations, to which their response then is, oh, but we can use this money and then, we can democratize this across every single SME. Now notice, this is not something that runs with their case, because if they've given you reasons for why SMEs are extremely resistant to change, I am unsure why this sort of democratization, even if it happens, is going to be accepted. But 2, I am not sure, given the cost of these sorts of things, like say, for instance, AI technologies, etc., they're going to want to do it, especially given that their margins in these sorts of regions, etc., are not immense, right? So they don't have lots of capital to just fucking go in and buy an AI system and like make themselves more efficient, especially given that they don't earn lots of money to begin with. So I'm not sure these sorts of things transcend or go to these organizations. What does happen though, regardless of whatever they want to do with their faces, is the fact that you get 1, lots of these sorts of organizations fail. And this is where I get to the second argument, right? So obviously all of these sorts of businesses operate on a kind of spectrum, right? So some SMEs are successful, some aren't, some are struggling, some aren't. Like that's just how economies work. Now, insofar as the ones that are successful, what do we do to the ones that are successful? I think one, given that you get lots of subsidies and given that per capita cost is lesser on their side of the house, we get one, more research and development. And these guys say, well, you won't do research and development because, loyalty and all of that sort of stuff. But no, likely you have profit incentives. And this is better research and development on our side of the house because you don't go in and fire workers altogether. There's a much more sustainable mechanism of getting research and development and getting better products. But two, you can subsidize prices. This is better because it allows you to expand into markets where MNCs, etc. operate. Right now, they have benefits like economies of scale, all of those sorts of things, which means that their products are cheaper. So now in our world, there is much more competition for MNCs, given that your prices, etc., are lower on that level. Now let's look at just generally competition. And these guys, their biggest point is, in our world, all of these sorts of things are sold to MNCs, right? Because risk anxiety exists on our side and not theirs. And the reason for this is, well, governments will give you money. Once you have money, once you know that you can operate a business, you won't sell it to an MNC like Google. I just think that this is not true. Insofar as they talk about, first of all, risk anxiety will always exist in our world because you're not sure whether this product will work or not. But two, Google can offer you $2 billion or $3 billion. I am really uncertain that developing countries and their governments are going to offer you the similar amount of money, especially in the short run, given the kinds of glorification that you've already done, insofar as lots of people in Silicon Valley are told, make an app, sell it, become a billionaire, live a chill life. So I'm not sure why competition happens in their world. Actually, MNCs get to buy it up. This is important then because you've funded lots of these organizations and then they just sell themselves off to private investors. But lastly, we told you, if these organizations are so good, amazing technology, revolutionizing the market, private investors such as angel investors already have incentives to want to fund them. What do they not get on their side? One, regional development, low skill local employment that we get on our side of the house. People who don't have skills in tech or IT get funding on our side, some sort of jobs on our side of the house when they don't get them in their side. We get incremental impacts, they don't. Very proud to propose.
All right, I'll acknowledge the second affirmative speaker. May I please request the second negative speaker to take the floor? Here.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Yeah, please go ahead.
Panel, this debate has gotten confusing because the affirmative don't acknowledge the comparative in this debate. The comparative, which I'll explain later, is this. In the short term, SMEs give you some small amounts of reliable funds. Startups in the short term will not survive without these government funds. With these government funds, they are more likely to survive and provide the things that we need them to provide. What is the nuance here? That without these funds, SMEs might still survive, but less, but reduce operations. Without these government funds, startups fail and we lose the benefits entirely. The long-term comparative is that SMEs, because they are in direct competition with MNCs. For instance, you have Walmart versus your mom and pop shop selling the same grocery items, they are in direct competition. And because of the framing Naveen gave you that these big companies want to become a monopoly, they have economies of scale, they're constantly expanding, SMEs will be phased out of the market. The comparative with startups is you are more likely on a balance. We admit there's a net low likelihood, but on a balance, we are more likely to develop a sustainable economy because startups are the only one in this debate that have the ability to carve out a niche market, consolidate it, and allow developing economies to leverage off of it and democratize this technology, or even just based off that startup, they're able to benefit. That's the comparative in this debate that I think they missed. Obviously, I'll explain more in detail later how this comparative manifests itself. But before that, two things that don't fit into my issues. The first, the speaker before me suggests that democratizing won't happen because Google can offer them a lot of money. One, I think governments have more likely to have the first mover advantage because these companies have to register. And obviously, the moment they register, governments get this information a lot faster than other corporations, and they're able to then act on it faster than big corporations. But secondly, I don't think this large sums of money is as appealing as you suggest it is. I think often the reason why people want to sell is because they have so much anxiety, because they don't think they can really develop their product or take it to the fullest. In a world where governments tell them you'll be helping your country, you can actually create so much more returns in the long run. I think people are likely to want more sustainable profits in the long run because they can feed their family better, they're likely to be happier, etc., etc. But the last thing, even if there's more net money that Google can offer, I think the nuance Navin told you is that people who create startups often are very aspirational. They want control over their own creation. This is often their baby that they work so hard to just grow and for the idea to bear fruition. And I think often them being able to have more control in our world, it means that they are more likely to say no to the buyout if it means governments buy some stakes in their company, but they're still able to control the intellectual property of that company. So on a net, I think startups are less likely to have a culture to sell. Second thing that doesn't fit in, they suggest that there's unlikely to be the democratizing of this technology. One, because it's unlikely for the technology to be democratized because SMEs are averse to change, as we suggest. One, in our world, governments can now advise SMEs to take on these things. I think they're more likely to trust the government. But perhaps more importantly, when governments have stake in the company and have some say in the production process, they can subsidize it or they can provide it at cheaper cost to SMEs, like through subsidies and so on, or also because governments have an incentive to provide cheaper goods for their citizens and not for overseas. They're likely to make sure that these goods are cheaper, products are cheaper, or at least give first movers advantage to the small, medium enterprises, which means we agree that SMEs are averse to change. But in a world where there are SMEs that want to adapt, we are more likely to give them the ability to adapt, and they're more likely to trust our adaptation, and they're more likely to be able to opt into our adaptation because it is cheaper, because governments have control, because governments are likely to help them in these instances. That's the conclusion. What is my one issue in this debate? Where do we get more return on public funds? Usually I have many issues, but today I'm going to take you on a chronological path in this debate. The first question we answer under this issue is, will startups fail? The first claim they make is that SMEs have a lot more brand value. I think startups initially cannot build brand value because they don't have that initial funding. With that government funding, they are more likely to build brands. And I think they're more likely to be able to carve out this brand in the long term as compared to an SME, because these startups have a disruptive mechanism. The fact that they are a startup to begin with, the fact that the government has chosen them, is that there's something very unique, very new that is likely to take consumers' attention and that consumers are likely to get behind, which is why with the culture of GoFundMes and so on, there's an increasing culture of startups and increasing interest in people to opt into startups with the gig economy and so on. Secondly, they say there are 4 reasons, but actually market research, new entrepreneurs not having market expertise, and them not being resilient to market shocks is basically the same thing. I have 4 responses. One, this initial funds that the government give can buttress these companies against these financial shocks, things that you wouldn't have been able to do in your world. Secondly, these startups can link with local government-linked companies in order to improve their production, to make it cheaper, and so on and so forth. Thirdly, governments can share data and market research, because stuff like ministries of transport and so on that already collect data, you don't have to invest millions again. You can use existing market research that governments are likely to have because they need to have it as part of as part of taxing people, so on and so forth. These things are transferable. We can lead to better market research. And lastly, the stuff about supply chains, I think we can build it over time, especially when governments are likely to have connections. Government-linked companies can act as your suppliers, so on and so forth. What is the conclusion to this? It is true that in status quo, startups are more likely to fail, which is exactly why this government intervention is so important, so necessary, and so unique in allowing these startups to flourish. The comparative is SMEs are likely to be predictable and reliable now, but they're likely to diminish over time. So what does this mean in 2 fronts? First, the short term. SMEs give you small, predictable returns. What happens to startups? Without the funds, they either fail and we don't get the benefit of innovation, or 2, they get bought out and monopolies are entrenched in these companies, which is such a huge harm that went unresponded to. These monopolies become entrenched when you force startups to look for corporations, you force them to get bought out because they don't have any other option. You're more likely to entrench monopolies, prices are likely to rise, quality is likely to be bad, and you become dependent on foreign monopolies as opposed to your own economy. In the the long term, however, for SMEs, they're likely to fail because one, they don't want to adapt, but two, big firms keep expanding and they're in direct competition. The comparative with startups with government help is one, governments can control them to some degree and make sure the monopoly is not entrenched. They can democratize these inventions to help SMEs. Two, these startups can now get funds from big firms while maintaining control about what startups to sell. So governments can now pick and choose what startups they think are okay to sell and what startups to entrench monopolies or should just be kept for the people. I think governments having that decision-making control allows us to uniquely pick the best startups and allow our economy to flourish best. What is the worst case comparison? Even if startups fail, even if most startups fail, I think one, they are more able to carve out a long-term niche that allows developing economies to one, hedge their bets on that startup because it's new, more people are likely to buy. Secondly, they gain a comparative advantage in that specific niche market that allows them to succeed later. And thirdly, other things in the economy can leverage off this startup to build their economy. Secondly, they are more able to compete with larger firms because they have disruptive mechanisms. And this is very important because yes, SMEs are more established. Yes, they have more access to supply chains, but they can never beat the economies of scale of big firms. They will always lose in this battle. But the reason why startups have more of a chance to win, while small, but on a net, right, have more chance to win, is because they have something new. They have a disruptive mechanism that allows them to fight against big corporations, and people may be interested just on face value. The taxi industry had a huge monopoly, but when Grab entered the market with their disruptive mechanism, even though initially it didn't have funds, they were able to get funds in the long term. The last claim they make is with regards to startups being redundant. One, governments can pick them reasonably well. Secondly, it's less likely to be redundant because they have this new disruptive mechanism. All their economic benefits are contingent upon proving that SMEs succeed more. And this issue has successfully proven startups succeed better, and all the byproducts of jobs and all that are more likely to follow in our world. For all these reasons, Taylor's is going to the semifinals. Thank you.
All right, I'll acknowledge the second negative speaker. May I please request the third affirmative speaker to take the floor?
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are. Yeah, please go ahead.
All right. Sorry, let me just set my timer. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, please take another look at the motion, which says the reallocation of funds that are existingly in startups to SMEs, i.e. opposition bench is not defending some idea of new funds going into startups. Startups are already currently given prioritization in terms of public funds. We are saying take this away and give it to SMEs. Because in status quo, despite this funding, 70% of tech startups fail. Lots of tech startups, despite this funding, still sell their technology to firms abroad and don't reap those benefits to the national country. Notice then, most of second neg's case was, oh, we get this funding now, so we solve the problem you pointed out in status quo. Sorry, no, because the problem in status quo exists despite this funding. Take another look at the motion. 2 bits of framing before I begin. The first bit of framing simply is that in the COVID-19 pandemic and generally trade wars across the world has shown us how flimsy our economies have become, how reliant we are on each other, and how frequently we can have demand shocks and stuff of that sort. In that frame, well, we probably don't need new technologies and new small startups, which despite government funding, being that they're extremely small, have really little capital, have really small consumer bases to begin with and need lots of time, are likely to fail at a whim's end at the point of which you have any shock. You should not be empowering that. You should be settling for stability, especially because that stability is likely to continue for decades to come, especially because the COVID-19 pandemic has put these sort of new AI type technology research back by a lot. So you should value stability over any sort of new market disruption that they come up with. The second bit of framing I want to talk to you about is I'm not too sure what sort of so unique and so amazing products these startups come up with. Notice there's currently a glorification in pop media and other sorts of things and movies and social media and all sorts of things about, oh, the glorification of being an entrepreneur, how it's the best thing that can happen to your life, how startups are amazing. That means tons of fucking people are opening startups. Like literally some of my friends open startups and I know they're going to fail. They're like, fuck it, right? So the idea basically here is that lots of people are opening startups. Most of them don't have experience. Most startups likely fail. Most startups, the products also are not very useful. Like sure, if you have another ride-hailing app, that's not how useful that can be. Most startups are just talking about other sorts of social media applications that people can use, because most startups cannot invest the huge amounts of, let's say, research and development costs, despite minimal government funding that's required to have massive AI projects. And even if they could, who on earth can afford those AI projects in the first place? I don't understand the benefits of negating, even if they prove them in the first place. But lastly, I would like to question this simple mechanism that, oh, startups will succeed because we will only pick the startups that succeed. Notice, guys, market research isn't currently collected by any government agency. And even if it was, the entire idea and analysis in F1 was these startups come up with new products, with new technologies, with new ideas that have not been tested in the market before. You need to collect market research again for them if you truly want to assess startup viability. I.e., most likely the government won't be able to assess startup viability. Market research is really difficult. Trust me, I'm doing this right now, my research. You need massive quantitative data. It's hugely costly. The idea then is most governments will be putting money in randomly into let's say startups, or based on minimal research, i.e. they can fail. Then, with that said, I would just like to point out that second negative did not rebut our case as to why startups fail, because their mechanism doesn't stand, and our argumentation about limited entrepreneurial experience, limited investors, no brand image, all of those types of things do not rely on money. The entire idea is you don't know whether this new product actually has a true market demand. Even if it's been successful, let's say, in the first 1,000 consumers, you necessarily don't know how much you can scale it. With SMEs, you have a short guarantee. Insofar as there are any benefits to startups, you need to prove the mechanism, because I don't see the bloody mechanism right now. With that, some couple of comparatives, even if both succeed, why the startups are generally better. Firstly, technology, change, innovation, stuff like that. They have this very weird conception that SMEs are resistant to change and can't innovate, even though most medium-sized firms do. That's how they kind of grow to large firms and actually compete in the first place. They give you two reasons, just assertions. First, they're traditionalists, so they can't change. I just reject that premise. I don't know why the traditionalists, even if they're family-owned, they have the market incentive to change. If you can provide them with a plan that they can change, if you provide them money and advice, I think they're likely to change. This is just an assertion by first leg, no matter how angry they look. Sorry, guys. Second thing, they already have existing systems. Notice, every firm has existing systems. That makes it easier for you to innovate in the first place. Notice the comparative here is you have existing product lines and product chains which allow you to start a new product, which allow you to run a new product line supply chain. One, because you have the experience that startup owners, entrepreneurs do not. Two, you've already done this before, so you're likely to do it better. Three, because you can diversify. You can allocate, let's say, if you're medium-sized firms, some resources into research and technology, probably more resources because you get government funding on our side. You also get other sorts of your general revenue stream, but startups have no revenue stream by their side, only government funding. You're likely to have more pool of money and existing business experience to have the research and development in the first place. But you can test those products better because you can have them in other sorts of market streams, and you can, if there's a loss, you have the other sorts of existing products to support you. This is why big firms are much better at market research. By that same logic, medium-sized and small firms are comparatively better than, let's say, testing out new products, research and development, all those sorts of things compared to startups. So if the comparative really is where do you get technological products and more, let's say, innovation, no, we get that way better on our side of the house. The last thing they said to this is, oh no, acquisitions will happen, and if you don't give these people money, acquisitions will happen, and blah, blah, blah. Notice acquisitions currently happen even at the point of which you're giving them money. But I don't think that's a valid enough point, right? Because if the acquisitions only happen if the product is so good that it's so obvious to people. In that context, no matter how much money you give, especially as a developing country, with limited funds to provide to this person, international tech businesses will still buy these startups no matter what, because they just have more money to offer. And they don't buy SMEs, for example, because they have more traditionalists. They're producing products that are not, let's say, as unique. So notice the rebuttals we get to this. The first say, oh no, government has a first mover advantage. I don't know, so what? Like, you're getting insulted to me, offer you more money later on. I don't see the point. They said, oh no, this is like the baby of the person and they would want control over it. This is contradictory. Because if the startup owners want control over their product, then surely they can't democratize the startup in the first place. Because even if the government would not have full control, maybe like 10% shares or something of that sort. So surely this contradicts their point about, oh, we can use this to democratize. That doesn't stand. But secondly, I think most big headhunters and like big IT firms, when they actually buy a startup, even if you provide them a little amount of money, the startup will still sell it because they offer the CEO, the founder of the startup, we're buying this, you get $2 billion and lots of leisure, lots of fun, but you can also join us for a job in Silicon Valley and work on your project as well. We'll just hire you as an employee, but the intellectual property rights will be ours. So that was the argument about, oh, it's your baby, so never sell it, stuff of that sort. I think on our word, on the comparative, if SMEs are provide more money and these startups are lucrative, they can actually try to buy a few startups and that SMEs can actually start to acquire them. I see that's much better. So technological change wise, they just have a better capacity to absorb risk and do that in the first place. Cost efficiency and risk. I think Vani sort of pointed out lots of reasons whether it's risk in startups, not refuted. Money just simply doesn't make those things go away. But cost efficiency is important because at the point at which you provide some money to, let's say, an SME, they can use existing supply chain and so on only to tackle the variable costs. They can subsidize stuff, especially where lots of small businesses do exist in, let's say, rural areas where subsidies would matter a lot more, i.e. they can make products cheaper for a very vulnerable part of your population. On the comparative, even if you have a little better apps, who the fuck uses them? Are people from urban sectors, privileged people who own smartphones in the first place? I don't understand the particular benefit. But notice lastly, SMEs have a better chance, and we told you this, for having more competition against larger firms. Who is likely to succeed? A startup which has very little money despite government funds, which has maybe a new idea but has not established the market at all, or an SME that can innovate and so on, but is still large enough to actually pose a threat. Actually, and when that threat is posed, you have better competition. All the benefits, second I talk to you, happen more in our side of the house. For all those reasons, so proud to propose.
All right, that was acknowledges the third affirmative speaker. May I please request the third negative speaker to take the floor?
Hi, can everyone hear me clear?
Yeah, you're audible, yeah.
Excellent, thank you. The reason why the side of AF is not going to take this debate is because they weren't willing to engage with the actual reasonings that we gave you as to why startups are comparatively far more likely to get more gains in the future, are far more likely to be more disruptive in the economy, and why the disruption means that we can mechanize the disruption in order for business operations to become A, more efficient, but also B, in order for us to be able to fight the monopoly that is currently being entrenched by large multinational corporations. Insofar as they don't explain how they actually stop MNCs from poaching startups, they don't solve this problem, we will still live in a world where SMEs are beholden to MNCs. They cannot just suggest that SMEs have the ability to fight MNCs without giving structural reasons as to why, with MNCs being able to continually poach these startups, continually file patents against them, continually acquire smaller companies, that we are able as SMEs to outcompete them. That is the biggest logical flaw from the case of affirmative. Before I talk about two questions in my speech, which I think quite nicely frames this debate. The first is, which is a better form of investment for the public sector, and secondarily, which is better to democratize markets and effectively make business operations fairer for individuals. I think this is both good and important because I think a more democratic market is one that has more access to individuals. Goods are far more likely to be less expensive. People have more choices. For all these reasons, we think a democratic market that allows more access to market share is better off. I have three responses to get out of the way before that. The first thing is this weird COVID-19 context that comes out from the speaker before me, because apparently, because of COVID-19 and the market being incredibly volatile and we're all in a recession, that's the reason why we ought to just err on the side of investing in very stable and predictable things. The first thing I would say is, bro, COVID-19 for now is like quite short-term, yeah? Investments are long-term, requires a long time for you to be able to see fruition in this. Because of this specifically, it's not an argument to just say that because right now we're in a recession, that we ought just like not care about like the developments of the economy right now. The fourth industrial revolution is still happening. Multinational corporations still have research and development wings that are trying to find ways to outcompete with SMEs and startups right now. All of these are like structures that are still working, even though we're in a pandemic. So we ought to find a way to compete with that, because insofar as we don't compete with these MNCs doing this, we cannot break that cycle. We will continue to remain in a an economy that is beholden to MNCs. You can't make money out of that. But the second thing I want to talk about is that this sort of motion meta that they try to do, right? They say like, oh look, right now we're just reallocating the funds from existing startups. I have three responses to this. The first is, right now, like if you take away funds from them, like you entrench the monopoly and all the harms that we say, you make them more vulnerable to poaching. You don't have a response to that. Second, even if like we are putting more money into startups right now, and we are happy to champion a world where the state increases funding for these startups as well, as opposed to increasing startups funding for SMEs. But the third and most important response to this is that we refuse the characterization that startups are right now not functional and are not making money because of government funding. We've told you from the beginning how we have seen multiple startups being able to be strong-armed by governments that were supportive. For example, Grab in Singapore, Setel in Malaysia, which is a new and growing startup that aims to like revolutionize the petroleum industry. Airbnb, medical startups all over the world are all startups that are currently being functional and are being strong-armed by governments so that they are able to shield themselves against multinational corporations that are poaching. Sure, some of them get poached, but at the very least, we reduce that scale significantly to allow far more democratization in the market. That scale difference is why the affirmative loses this debate. But the third thing I want to talk about is their argumentation proving why structurally startups are bad, because they said that we don't engage with their structural reasons about how they're all not apparently good business people. They're all stupid college graduates. They don't have any relationship in the market. Like, bro, this is so ignorant of what like existing as a startup in a market is, given that if you have public investment funding from the government, you also have access to other startups, you have access to government services, you have access to government resources that allow you to become significantly more efficient, you have access to research and data by the government because they also have a stake in your investment. For all these reasons, we believe that startups also have an incentive and can be good. You cannot hinge the affirmative case on a stupid characterization that all startups are just dumb college graduates. That just makes the debate incredibly stupid. But I think the one like interesting thing they say here is that because all startups right now are in the market and they're all in the tech industry, they're kind of all just doing the same thing and no one's actually doing anything different. Like, that tells me that there are a lot of startups in the market. That doesn't actually prove why all startups are doing the same thing. The tech industry is an incredibly vast industry. The blockchain technology, cloud computing technology are all new forms of technology that have various different innovative potentials to revolutionize the entire market space, to disrupt technologies at large. There are many different ways to disrupt a market, and insofar as there's an infinite amount of potential to reform markets through startups engaging and having new revolutionary ideas, we ought to err on the side of like allowing this degree of innovation. For these three reasons already, the F is out of this debate. Two issues. Firstly, which is a better form of investment? I will answer two questions within this. Number one, who needs this money most? And number two, who can get better gains? Who needs this money most? I think Naveen was very, very clear in his speech when he told you that SMEs right now already have a predictable revenue stream. Sure, they don't make a lot of money because I think like the traditionalist reasons that he suggested to you, it goes beyond just like, there's a family, this business, therefore they don't want to make a lot of money. It is because of the fact that they are resistant towards huge overhauls of entire business models. If you're going to incorporate things like AI in your business, it requires completely injecting huge amounts of cost into your business to like incorporate this technology. But like in a world, so what I'm trying to say here is that because they have predictable revenue streams, they can get things like business loans quite easily. Startups can't do that, right? Because startups don't have a revenue stream, don't have credibility in the market yet, and oftentimes are incredibly new in the market. So I'm uncertain as to why there's a deity for these SMEs to require public investment fundings in order to thrive. We've proven that the potential of startups to use this money far better is greater under our. But the second thing I want to say also within this is that startups right now are selling out, and the reason they are selling out is because number one, they cannot afford huge amounts of money to file for things like patents. They cannot afford for things like manufacturing facilities and to develop their apps, for example, or to make their market trials and market research, for example. All of these are key important forms of funding that's required in the initial stages of a business operation that you can't, that SMEs don't necessarily need. This is why it's so easy for Apple to just buy out the company and the startup that came up with Touch ID. Pfizer did this as well with the pioneering antiretroviral treatments as well. It's incredibly easy for you to poach them out when you don't give them enough funding at the beginning. The more funding we give, the more we shield ourselves against this. Who can get better gains at the end of the day? We think SMEs are far more risk averse, and that's the key word I'm using here. Yeah? By traditional, Naveen meant risk averse individuals. If they are risk averse, number one, I don't know why the argument before me about like SMEs like more likely to absorb and buy startups is likely. It requires a huge amount of capital for you to acquire a startup. Like if their argument is they must give $2 billion from YouTube to acquire a startup, that literal cost must also apply to your SMEs. Tell me why they would have that huge amount of cost. But the reason why they don't want to acquire and they won't change and restructure to become better under your work is because the comparative to accessing things like AI, new technology, once MNCs have acquired it, or once they're incredibly expensive because they have been licensed and patented by Western companies, is that they would have to pay these licensing fees. The comparative under our world is when the state has a stake in that investment, when MNCs don't have patents over important technologies that could revolutionize developing countries and developing economies. That's why you have more of a likelihood for your local SMEs to incorporate this. We see this right now through local SMEs being able to incorporate things like QR paying mechanisms, bypassing traditional payment payment mechanisms in a lot of developing countries because of the fact that the governments and the GLCs and government companies have a working relationship with the market. The last thing, and really quickly, which is better to democratize the markets. I think it is incredibly important for the team of F to deal with breaking monopolies of big MNCs and entrenching their power. SMEs cannot be competitive insofar as MNCs have control over new technologies, are existent price makers in the market, have economies of scale like Navin and Hans both told you, to lower costs, negotiate better deals, to use AI, to use metadata, to acquire new technology. These are various reasons for me to believe that MNCs will just continue to metastasize in size and not allow for startups or any SMEs to compete. I know it sounds like we're trying to win the debate. We're trying to I know it sounds like we're trying to eat our cake and have it at the same time. I think that's the saying. But really, this is a process. It's a chronological order. And this chronological order is the one that's most logically astute. Thank you.
All right, I'll acknowledge the third negative speaker. Can I please have the negative reply? Can the speaker unmute himself?
Yeah,
One second.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Affirmative loses this debate because they were uncomparative and not understanding of the framing from the first speaker. That in the fourth industrial revolution, with the growth of artificial intelligence, robots, and so on, we need to find a way to get on that. We need to find a way to hop onto that train and adapt our economy accordingly. So I'll answer later whether SMEs will adapt and what happens better. But before that, just one quick point of clarification. I think the speaker before, Gov Whip, suggests that this debate is about a reallocation and thus our benefits don't happen because we have to defend status quo. So one, I think in status quo, some governments allocate to SMEs, some allocate to startups in status quo. We would suggest you should allocate it to startups all the time instead of SME. But secondly, it's a comparative, right? So obviously, if you pull out funds from startups and fund less startups on a net, then instead of our things being benefits, they become harms in your world. Okay. So because you lose the money to be able to do all the things we want to do. So I think that response is extremely weird and doesn't make sense in any world. First question I'll answer is, will SMEs adapt? Because we told you four things. The first, that they're often family-based and don't have outside expertise. Second, restructuring often requires firing a lot of people that they often have personal connections to that they don't want to, or just had a long-standing business model and they don't want to fire people. Thirdly, they are risk averse because they have low profit margins and they are scared to change. But fourthly, they are more able to adapt in our world when SMEs have more access to startup technology. With the democratization of this technology, we're able to subsidize it for them, give it to them once it's built, and they're able to then change their business model accordingly, more likely to trust the government, it's likely to be cheaper, so they're more able to opt into it. The government whip response to this is that instead, in their world, which was just in government whip, by the way, small, medium enterprises should eventually acquire startups. But wait a minute. All their analysis suggests that startups will never succeed, startups will never do well. This is a principal concession that startups have some value and that we need startups to somewhat succeed so that they can buttress the fourth industrial revolution and so that SMEs can then leverage off these startups. So the question then becomes, where are we able to buttress these things? Because the premise here is that SMEs are already unable to adapt in the government because all our other reasons went unresponded to. So will startups fail? They suggest there's brand value, lack of expertise, etc., to which we told you three things. Firstly, that these initial funds, because governments have first movers advantage, can buttress economic shocks and can ensure that they don't affect the startups as horribly to a point where they have to shut down or have to accept a buyout from a large corporation. Secondly, they can link with local government-linked companies to ensure like production chains are cheaper, to ensure that transport costs are cheaper. So on a net, their cost becomes cheaper, it's more likely to work. Thirdly, governments can share data, market research because of their respective ministries, and they can build supply chains because obviously governments will have connections to individuals in different industries. What's the conclusion to this? One, that startups are quite likely to succeed in a world where we give them government funds. But most importantly, even if most startups fail, some succeed. A few succeed, even if we accept the premise that most startups fail. And why did we also tell you that even if the worst case was true, we still win this debate? 3 reasons. The first, we're able to carve out a long-term niche in the economy and consolidate that. Secondly, other firms like small, medium enterprises can leverage off this comparative advantage and can then adapt accordingly. The conclusion to this is that our method, or like our economic model, is more long-term. It leads to a more sustainable economy where we may get less returns in the short run, but we're able to carve out a more sustainable economy so that all the byproducts that they want, like jobs, etc., more return on investment, is more likely to happen. The comparative in small, medium enterprises is that it is short-term reliable, but in the long term, they're like to be phased out of the economy regardless of the amount of government funds you give them, because they are competing in the same grounds as multinational corporations. The comparative is startups change the game. They compete in a different lane entirely, and thus they are more able to compete. Even if you don't believe any of this, we tell you this buyout will entrench monopolies, lead to lower quality goods, hiking up of prices, and there's likely to be no competition in the market in their world. The conclusion is this: even if only 1 or 2 startups succeed in our world, we still win this debate because we carve out long-term niches. For all these reasons, we take this debate. Thank you.
All right, now acknowledges the negative reply. Can I please request the affirmative reply to end the debate? Thank you.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Yeah, please go ahead.
I'm just going to run you through how I saw this debate. Let's first of all start with what we said. We said that the best kinds of startups, the ones that are likely to be successful, change the whole fucking economy, are going to get money from private investors anyways. They're going to get billions of dollars because their idea is unique and their idea is something that can be done to the market. And therefore, they don't need this sort of government money. Especially, by the way, I would point out, we told you that there's no reason for them to go to the government, given the framing that these guys have been giving you, right? The government can control some degree of intellectual property rights and then choose to democratize where this sort of access to their products gets to. Insofar as this is true, I'm sure like the best kinds of startups, the ones that will revolutionize the market and change everybody's lives, are not going to be given any sort of government support. Then they'd say, like, let's look at subsidizing these sorts of startups, right? I'm not sure whether they subsidize the best ones, but let's just assume that they subsidize lots of startups and some are set to succeed. What is the problem with these sorts of startups? I think one, there are lots of MNCs already in the market. What they don't do is prove to you why we are going to outweigh the comparative advantage of MNCs. What they do say is you perhaps have additional capacity to do so, but they never tell you that MNCs are going to actually not be able to do this. The second thing I will point out, and this is something that gets no response in negative, is startups suffer from saturation. It's not that everybody's doing the same thing, but oftentimes startups are trying to solve similar problems. That is to say that millions of startups across the globe are trying to find out solutions to things like transportation, green energy, all of those sorts of things. And the problem is that startup investment is always going to be long run, right? So at the point at which you give them money and look at the analysis that they give you, right? Patents, trials, marketing, research, all of this is going to take time. So presumably what can happen in your world with this gambling is that another startup, which can presumably make a better product or make it much more faster and get the first mover advantage, will get this advantage. And this is something that I've gotten from in my speech as well. So it's unclear whether this sort of startup is actually going to get all of the benefits that these guys want to talk about. The second thing I want to talk about is this long-term, short-term thing. And I'm going to accept this idea that they've been pushing, right? 1 or 2 succeed. Let's look at what happens with 1 or 2 succeed. I want to point you out towards like the mechanism that they've given you. We are going to not only do all of this, give all this money to the startup, but we're also going to give money to like lots of these SMEs so that they can integrate this, subsidize all of this sort of stuff so we can democratize it. I think one, that is like a really unrealistic idea of how the world works. I'm pretty sure governments are cash strapped. They don't have the fucking money to first build up a startup and then give it to SMEs and then also subsidize that. That's just not possible. If that was possible, then presumably we could also have access to do both, right? That's the first thing. But the second thing is, I think this proves a crucial concession in their case, which is to say that for startups to succeed, you must also build in local capacity to take in all of the products from the startups. So you must have purchasing power in the short run. These businesses must use it already. But what don't they do? And I want to point you out specifically to the kind of characterization they've been running for SMEs. They say SMEs are going to lose out to multinational corporations for a host of reasons like traditionalism and whatever. If we accept all of this is true, and if we accept that all of this money is going to startups, I am unsure why this failing SME in the long run is going to be able to afford all of the stuff that these guys are talking about. So insofar as that is true, I am not sure why these benefits that they're talking about of a startup accruing, like giving AI to the poorest of the poor, revolutionizing everything, is going to happen, because their long-term impact relies on short-term capacity that they have not built. And that, I think, is the important metric in this debate, because insofar as that is not true, they don't get to get all of their material accepted. Now let's point out towards like expansion, right? We've given you reasons for why. One, there's a market-based incentive for all of these sorts of SMEs to expand. So it's not like they're always going to be technologically averse. When it makes sense for them, they will. I want you to note, and SM also told you, their sort of structural reason is a characterization. It's not something that's rooted in a structure. It's just them saying it's traditional, it's family-based. Lots of sorts of SMEs are not family-based, right? Garage owners oftentimes don't have like these sorts of family-based structures or everything. So I think there is an incentive for expansion. And insofar as that is true, we also get lots of benefits from that expansion, especially for local populations which get cheaper products. And the last thing, these sorts of startups are always going to be bought up by like monopolies and everything in their world, especially because risks still exist. And private actors have more money than governments will ever be able to give you. For all these reasons, very proud to propose.
All right, I'll acknowledge the affirmative reply. Thanks to both the teams for a wonderful